How's it going, everybody? International Master Danny Rensch here again for Chess.com and Chess.com's YouTube channel, highlighting all the greatest and best action from Week 8 of the United States Chess League. It's not really fair that I say all the greatest and best action because we don't have that much time, but we're highlighting a few games for you, trying to find the most instructional moments possible and talk about what happened with all of your favorite players and teams this week. So here we started with the game between Alex Stripunsky and now International Master Tom Bartell. And at first I thought we might see one of the sharper variations of the Tarrasch French. But Stripunsky elected to play knight g to f3, which of course not really an obscure variation, but maybe not the most popular. And after c takes d4, continued with this move knight takes d4, which again, not as popular as some of the mainline variations with e takes d5. But Stripunsky, along with the next game I'm going to cover between Robert Hess and International Master Mark Esserman, kind of gets one of the psychological/preparation awards for the week, in the sense that in facing his very talented and very tactically driven, very aggressive opponent, Tom Bartell, he chose one of the variations with not that much bite, but a line that goes to an endgame after the trade of minor pieces and the move c4. White forces play into an endgame that has maybe not the most pull for white, so we're not pretending that white has a clear edge or anything, but a small positional advantage based simply on the 2 versus 3 majority for white, and the fact that black's pawn structure is leaving something to be desired, with these pawns sort of split apart from each other, making them a little bit easier to target. We're not going to go through the whole endgame, but I wanted to highlight his approach against Bartell, and it's not anything against Tom Bartell or Mark Esserman next, more so actually a compliment to them, that they're two of the players I consider GM slayers pretty much every time they sit down to play a US Chess League game, often finding themselves playing on boards 1 and never really any lower than board 2 for their respective teams. Bartell and Esserman are just very talented players and very, very aggressive. They're not a fun opponent to play because they're really willing to go after you. So for Stripunsky to choose this sort of slightly obscure, maybe not uncommon variation, but one that didn't have a ton of bite, and then proceed to really outplay Bartell for the next 20 moves, reaching this position here after the trade of rooks, where the 2-on-1 finally becomes a 1-on-none, and with it, of course, isn't necessarily a decisive advantage, but as we know, most of these endgames are won eventually by creating a second weakness. And in this case, there was no exception. As I said, it was almost exactly 20 moves later when Stripunsky really flexed his endgame muscles and his experience over Bartell with a very strong move here. You can try to find, if you want to pause the video and actually try to evaluate, how would you approach an endgame with one extra pawn, bishops of the same color, in this situation? Okay, assuming you pause the video and look for a chance, hopefully even using my clue of principle of two weaknesses, you found the move h4, which is an exclam, preparing a very simple plan to target black's pawns and keep them on dark squares, making it much more difficult for black to defend as long as the pawns are on dark squares for this bishop to target. Bartell played g6, which may not have been the best approach, but he was worried about the g7 pawn becoming a target after a move like h5, and white can continue to flex the pawns and try to put more pressure there. So Bartell tried to choose a slightly more active defense. It's always risky when you move pawns. Usually, if you don't know what to do, the best answer is don't do anything at all. And in this case, Bartell may have made his job a little bit harder by making the h-pawn such an immediate and direct, easy target. But Stripunsky still had to show some technique. After the move f5, king to c4, king to c7, chooses the plan of bishop a5 check, and then offering an exchange of bishops, which of course will be denied, but ends up allowing white to put his bishop on a much more dominant position than black's. After bishop g7, bishop f8, and finally bishop f6, we see that though the bishops are the same color, and it's interesting when you see one clearly sort of putting the clamps down on the other, even though both seem to have a lot of squares to move to, this bishop not really so, because leaving this diagonal will allow ideas with bishop to g7 on a regular basis, so black has to be very careful. Stripunsky actually really showed some technique here with the fiddling of the bishop, eventually forcing black's bishop to this defensive diagonal, and finally creating some inroads for the king. By bringing the bishop to e7 and manipulating black's bishop off of the ideal position, putting pressure on the pawn, Finally, bishop to g7. Zugzwang is almost to be had. All this king wants is to use this pawn as a decoy in order to make his way over to the king side and win. And Stripunsky is eventually able to do that, forcing Bartell's hand, winning the 2 pawns for 1, and eventually winning the h-pawn. Amazing to see that it doesn't really matter that it's only 1 pawn left, as the bishop and king are not in an ideal position. If this king were much closer, it might be a lot harder for white to offer a trade of bishops because it's a corner pawn, but in this case it's really no challenge for white, and Bartell simply resigned after bishop to g5. King to c6 would be met by h6, and whether the bishop moves or the king moves, bishop f6 comes, and the game is over. Let's move on to the second game I've already referred to, between Grandmaster Robert Hess and International Master Mark Esserman. As I said in the outset, Stripunsky and Hess win the awards for psychological preparation, # the right approach against a younger opponent, in my book for this week. Stripunsky already being seen to have chosen again, I don't want to say obscure or sideline because it's not, but one that he definitely knew better than Bartell and was not in Bartell's wheelhouse because it went to this endgame, where he was able to really play a long, grinded out style, and Bartell not as comfortable in those types of games as most younger players aren't. And here Hess, of course, not being the most active player anymore, choosing the English, and I believe it was joked by Grandmaster Irina Krush in the broadcast that this is where chess players go who aren't really chess players anymore, is to English and knight f3. But that didn't really prevent Robert from getting a big advantage out of the opening, and after e3, bishop b4, plays an aggressive idea here with knight to d5, and a good idea. And white is not avoiding direct threats in the opening just because Hess is playing the English. And after knight d5, rook e8, this move queen f5 came in, and it was already clear that Esserman was not comfortable in the position. Taking some time here, he was not able to come up with the best move. Knight takes d5, he obviously didn't like the idea of helping white to kick the knight around. Knight e7 after takes would likely just be met by queen takes e5, simply picking up a pawn. And other moves, in some cases, run into either taking and doubling the pawns, or in other cases, tricky ideas with knight to g5 and bishop to d3. So, as obscure as the opening was, it doesn't mean that you're not challenging your opponent. And in the case of Stripunsky and Hess, I believe they just get credit for taking their opponents a little bit out of their comfort zone, when they're definitely the kind of opponents that most grandmasters don't like to face. So, no snide against Esserman or Bartell. In fact, if anything, a compliment, and just a little bit surprised by how well these two grandmasters handled the talented Esserman and Bartell. So, bishop to e7, it was talked about whether or not Hess would take the e5 pawn, but he answered those questions by simply taking the e5 pawn. And as amazing as you might think it sounds, after less than 10 moves, or I guess 10 moves exactly, we have a position where white has the bishop pair, an extra pawn, and a positional advantage. So despite, don't believe the rumors out there, kids, that you can't do good things or aggressive things with a slow opening like the English, right? Hess proved that to be wrong here, and it was definitely a shocker for everyone watching to see white get such a big advantage so quickly. Hess plays queen to c2 because why not? I'm up a pawn, and why do anything crazy? And basically plays simple chess, developing the pieces, and forces his opponent to do something crazy, in a case where you consider that if black doesn't do anything here, he's down the bishop pair, a pawn, and basically in a resignable position almost already. So Esserman does what he does best and tries to complicate the matters, which turns into a lot of smoke and mirrors, though unfortunately that ends up being all it is smoke and mirrors, and resigns before move 30. So really great wins by both Hess and Stripunsky, but neither one of them earned a Game of the Week slot for them. Now we're going to move on to a few of my favorites, which all three games ended up earning Game of the Week candidates. All right, everybody, that was Week 8, U.S. Chess League highlights video. Make sure you follow the action when it's happening on Chess.com TV, Tuesday and Wednesday nights. You can follow the games live in the Chess.com arena. Make sure that you follow the league on Twitter. Go to their website to find out more information, and join the fan clubs on Chess.com. I know I've told you before, but just go ahead and do it. You can follow me on Twitter as well, and we will see you around on Chess.com.